We live under an economic system called capitalism. I'm going to start this video by explaining how this system works as simply as possible. Now, central to understanding any economic system is understanding the class relationships within it. Under capitalism, there is a distinct capitalist class who have a monopoly of ownership over the means of production. And then there is a distinct labouring class, the working class, who don't own the means of production. Means of production are things used to produce commodities. This includes the instruments of labour, machinery, tools and equipment workers use to manufacture commodities, as well as the subject of labour, the component parts and raw materials that workers transform into commodities. Commodities are simply the goods and services the capitalist class produces to sell for a profit. The working class requires these commodities to survive, but because the capitalist class has a monopoly on the production of commodities, workers have to obtain these commodities from the capitalists. So, in order to get the commodities they need to survive, the working class has to sell their labour power to the capitalist class in order to afford their basic human needs. And so the capitalists use this labour power, along with the means of subsistence, to produce commodities. Labour power is essential in generating the value in these commodities. Now, here is the important bit. The aim of the capitalist is to sell their commodities for more money than they spent producing them. So they want to sell the commodity for more than the total money they spent on the components of the commodity, the wear and tear of the instruments of labour, and the labour power of the people who actually did the manufacturing of said commodities. So again, to be clear, in order for the capitalist class to make a profit off of the production they pay for, the people actually doing the production, the working class, have to be paid less than the total value they create for the capitalists. The worker only spends some of the working day creating the value represented by their wages. The rest of the working day, the worker creates a surplus of value for the capitalist. Surplus value is the profit enjoyed by the capitalist class. The working class lives on only a fraction of the value they create. The capitalist class lives on the surplus value created by the workers. The value created by the working class is therefore essentially stolen by the capitalist class. This is the capitalist system, the capitalist mode of production. This is the economic order we all live under. It's one giant pyramid scheme. The labouring masses are exploited and robbed by the ruling elite. But that's just basic economics. So, key points. Commodity production. Profiteering/surplus value, exploited wage labour, monopoly ownership of the means of production by a distinct capitalist class. I felt it was important to just go over all that quickly before we get into the main subject of today's video, which is about cultural production in relation to the capitalist mode of production. Now, what do I mean by cultural production? When I talk about cultural production, I'm talking about the actual manufacture of cultural artifacts. Things like books and music and plays and paintings and architecture, but also stuff like movies and TV shows and games. It's a broad field, a lot to look at. I won't be able to look at all forms of cultural production today. I'll cover some of the ones that people are more generally familiar with, but I think people will find that this analysis is pretty much universally applicable. And when we look at cultural production in relation to capitalism, the production of these cultural artifacts, of this cultural output, especially the production of everything we might refer to as art, so much of what we engage with is heavily commodified. Culture is a product that is sold to us, because under capitalism, everything is a product, a commodity to be bought and sold for the sake of profit. And that might seem like a bleak take or a cynical take, and it's not. It's just the way the economy works, the way the economy functions. And the economy functions the way it does because of the historical period we're in. So naturally, because we're at a point in time where the mode of production is capitalist in nature, everything is commodified. And people may have heard this all before, this idea of art and culture and the present being commodities, being products. It's not really a new take. It's not original or unique or novel. However, when people usually say stuff like that, they're usually talking specifically about stuff they don't like. If we take movies as an example, people will dismiss a movie as a product simply as a way of expressing that they don't like it, that they think it's of low quality. But the thing is, most movies are products. Most movies are commodities. Movies have existed within a system of commodity production for most of the history of the art form. One of the earliest movie studios in the US was established by a notorious capitalist, Thomas Edison. And when movie production started up in California, in Hollywood, the studios over there were also inherently capitalist. You had people with large reserves of money producing these movies with the expectation that they receive large returns on their investment. These weren't artist collectives. These were corporations trying to turn a profit. And this is true for all Hollywood productions. Even the more artsy movies, they're made and designed to sell to a specific demographic. Even A24, which is one of the most celebrated firms in Hollywood right now, distributing a lot of critically acclaimed films. And these films may not make Avengers money, but they still make money. They're still products that A24 is trying to sell to make a profit. Even if the movie is super personal to the filmmakers, or they put in a lot of artistic and creative energy into it to try and make it something special, they're still products. And that shouldn't diminish any artistic achievement. Because again, everything under capitalism is a product. Everything is commodified. And you can make a movie that you think is the most non-commercial movie ever, but the right salesperson will find an audience to sell it to, a way to profit off of it. If your definition of artistic integrity is pegged to non-commerciality, to the idea of something not being a commodity, then you're gonna have a problem trying to enjoy art under capitalism. And of course, independent movies do exist, and art house movies, fan movies, etc. But at the same time, a lot of these movies will end up being distributed by large capitalistic firms, commodifying the art, turning it into something that helps the firm generate surplus value, generate a profit. A larger company will sell independent movies on Blu-ray or arrange a wider cinema release, or it'll be bought to be shown on Netflix or Amazon or Apple, or hell, maybe it will just be sold on Amazon or on YouTube or some other digital sales platform. And even if you manage to somehow avoid all that, if the cultural output that you consume is just this wholly independent art, the production of that art still involves capitalism somewhere. Again, with movies, they're filming on a camera made by a large conglomerate and using editing software made by a corporation. My point is not to try and make you feel bad or to suggest that you can't enjoy art under capitalism. My point is that under the capitalist mode of production, culture is heavily commodified. But that doesn't necessarily mean the culture you enjoy is inherently bad. All it means is that you live under specific historical conditions, specific socio-economic conditions, specific material conditions. The culture around us is shaped by those conditions. And so in an economic system where commodity production is so central, an economic system where capitalists are always looking for new ventures, new ways to produce surplus value, culture is also transformed by capitalists into another venue for commodity production. So what if the movie you enjoy is a commodity? As long as you enjoy it, as long as you connect with it, as long as you take something positive from it, and as long as you're aware of the economic reality of the product, well, that's the main thing. It doesn't matter if it exists purely for the sake of profiteering. But let's go more into this idea of profiteering, of surplus value, of cultural production firms trying to ensure their cultural output produces the largest returns possible. How do you do that? Well, we already discussed underpaying your labourers, and that's certainly a factor we'll get into in a bit. But there are other ways. For instance, 2 different movies released at the same time will typically cost the consumer the same regardless of their budget. Whether it's cinema tickets or Blu-rays or buying on digital, the movies sell for the same price. So, for the studio, if they're going to spend a lot on a movie, they're going to expect high volumes of sales for that movie. But inversely, it's far more profitable if they can make a low-budget movie or a bunch of low-budget movies but still see a moderate volume of sales for that movie. Then they've still made large returns. A lot of horror movies and comedy movies are like this. They don't need a big CG budget, but they can get some interest based on some gimmick or an actor or a director who's involved with it. When you're making those big budget movies, it's important they appeal to the largest audience possible so you can get the largest return possible. And it's why all those Marvel movies are the way they are, to try and make the returns they do. It was a tried and tested formula that worked really well, that earned Marvel's parent company billions until it didn't, because market trends keep changing. And it's why so many movies are franchise movies or based on popular intellectual properties. These tend to generate greater returns than movies that aren't. But this is where people begin to have a negative reaction to the reality of cultural output being commodified. They are products, and oftentimes they start to feel like products. You don't want to feel like you're being sold to, pandered to, in order to secure the large returns that the capitalists want. And this becomes a discourse within film criticism. Is it bad that movies like this are an attempt at mass appeal instead of an artist trying to say something real, something from the heart? And in that respect, you start getting trapped in a whole spiral of idealism about what is real art and why mass media is evil. But to bring it back around, it is the nature of the economic order we live under. These commodities exist for profit making, but that doesn't also mean there's no artistic or creative vision there. Though sometimes that creativity gets buried under the profiteering. Let's move on from movies and talk about video games. Video games, an art form of a kind that largely developed under capitalism. You can look to the short history of this medium and see lots of examples of potentially great games that were rushed to publication before they were done. We can blame so many buggy games on capitalism, on the capitalist need to profit off of something with minimal costly production time. And these products, which creative people did work very hard on, end up getting really bad press and a bad reputation. And sometimes games aren't just buggy, but the capitalists will encourage game mechanics that serve profitability, whether it's chasing market trends or implementing systems like microtransactions or expensive DLC packs. And in the latter cases, this is especially insidious. It takes a thing you paid for, this product you own, and it turns it into a marketplace for more products. And it's all about generating as much profit as possible. That's what a lot of cultural production is configured for, is what it strives for, what it really cares about. And yeah, like independent movies, there's also independent games. But an independent company, any independent company that's actually trying to make it as an actual business, they also seek to generate surplus value to amass large quantities of profit, not just for the personal use of the owners of the company, but then also to supply the initial investment for the production of more commodities, more products in the future. With indie games, not every game is like Undertale or Stardew Valley where it's one person or a tiny team doing everything. A lot of independent studios are businesses that use the labor of others to produce these games. They may not be as large as the big AAA studios, but they're still reliant on workers creating surplus value for them. And of course, by extension, this is true of independent business in any area of cultural production, be it film or music. And it brings us to our next point. Art and these other creative ventures, they don't just manifest themselves out of thin air. They are produced through labour, through the expending of labour power by a worker. And it's not always just as one individual artist working alone in a studio. The nature of industrial capitalism has meant that teams and sometimes armies of labourers are involved in cultural production, just like every other area of capitalist production. When you think about industrialism, the productive process directly linked to the development of capitalism, industrialism isn't just about factories and machines, it's also about the large numbers of labourers, of workers employed to produce things on larger scales. And this allows for larger quantities of output, but also much larger projects like the construction of skyscrapers, large infrastructure projects and gigantic ships. And the exploitation of this large quantity of labour power is the foundation of capitalism as an economic system, and it is central in cultural production under capitalism. Cultural production in the 21st century is this industrial process that sees so many people involved in the production of things like movies and games and TV shows and all sorts of other stuff. I think people are getting a lot wiser to this now, but there's still some people who treat things like movies as if they're just made by a director and a bunch of actors. And if people stick around for the credits, they're going to see a lot more names, especially with these big CGI heavy movies. And it's the people who do a lot of that CGI and animation and work in video games, the digital artists, people generating images on computers for a living. A lot more attention has been given to the fact that these people are underpaid and overworked. And these are the people creating the surplus value for these cultural products, who necessarily are the people who make hundreds of millions of dollars of profit possible. And in some cases, maybe they're even getting paid a middle-class salary or whatever, but the effect on their standard of living, on their health, that has been called into question. And they're not being paid for all the value they create, as we've discussed. And they are working very long hours to create that value. These are the people who aren't on the surface, aren't A-list celebrities, aren't the face of the commodity we buy, but they're still an integral part of the production of these commodities, of the cultural output we enjoy. And this is true of everything under capitalism, and it's true of all cultural production by capitalists. Again, these aren't artist collectives. These are paid labourers who have essentially been coerced into exchanging their labour for the means to live, even though they've been offered a really shit deal. Cultural production is only possible due to labour, and under capitalism this means the exploitation of the labour power of others. It's the labourers who turn film stock into movies, it's the labourers who turn tree pulp into novels, who turn noises into music, who turn ones and zeros into video games. The role of an artist, or anybody who works in any creative industry in a creative capacity, is incredibly mystified, but they are just as much workers as the workers in any other industry, as much workers as factory labourers, as retail workers, as delivery drivers, as office workers, as sanitation workers, and so on. And it's also important to keep in mind that while people will talk about individual cases of poor employer conduct, the overworking or mistreatment of actors or writers or whoever, this is never individual. This is never about isolated cases. There are no isolated cases. It's all systemic. Exploitation of labour doesn't happen only with one group of workers working on one specific project. You only know about those workers because they spoke out, because they tried to fight back. But for every worker that comes forward, that unionises and organises or is vocal about maltreatment, there are millions of others that don't. And this is true of all industries across all of commodified capitalist cultural production and across all other areas of capitalist production as well. It's a class issue, not an individual case-by-case issue. It's not a Disney issue, it's not a Warner Brothers issue, it's not a Sony issue. All of them are a problem, but all other capitalist firms are as well. They all collectively exploit the working class. One class, the working class, exploited by another class, the capitalist class. And that is a central element of the capitalist mode of production. The value, the profits that the capitalists want would not be possible without exploited labor. And yet, too often these workers are forgotten about. So often the output of capitalist cultural production is viewed as the product of individual great artistic minds, or else product of some brand or faceless studio. Sure, the people who actually labor to make it possible are included in the credits. But how many of us actually read the credits? I know I don't. I don't have the time. And never forget, the only reason those names are there in the first place are due to workers organizing to ensure they're recognized for their work in some capacity. Because you know they won't be recognized in the form of fair wages. Even if the workers entered some sort of mutually agreed upon contract and they've consented to the wage they're receiving, it doesn't change the reality that the laborers create far more value for the capitalist class than is reflected by their wages. Again, the surplus value that workers create, that is the entire purpose of capitalist production, and so is absolutely central to capitalist cultural production. If the capitalist class could not exploit labor in this manner through cultural production, they would not invest in cultural production. And one last thing about surplus value and how it relates to laborers who create it. When you consider these cultural commodities, thinking specifically about the big industries, movies, music, television, video games, unlike most commodities, they're not wholly consumed once they've been sold. Thousands of hours of labor time are spent producing one single commodity, one movie, one game, etc. And the labourers who made it are paid, and the capitalists sell the commodity. And this single commodity in question is distributed in such a way that it can be distributed to lots of buyers at once, whilst the capitalists retain ownership of it. Thinking about CDs and DVDs, thinking about streaming, there's various means. And it means the capitalists who own this commodity can continue to sell this commodity in perpetuity without having to buy any more labour power from the workers who actually made the commodity. And that kind of means the surplus value being generated by that commodity, it's kind of infinite. And sure, some of the people who worked on it might get residuals, but like with movies, it's mainly the big name actors or directors, but the boom mic operators, the editors, the CG artists, the craft service people, they're not getting residuals. And it's all really kind of fucked up when you try and think deeply about it all. There's so much going on here, and these questions of the nature of intellectual property and how that factors into the capitalist mode of production. And you can think about it for hours trying to figure it all out, all the levels to it, all the nuances and stuff. Cultural production has become this very unique and complex form of commodity production, of capitalist production, and there's so much to entangle. But the basic laws of capitalist production still remain the same. It's still production of commodities based upon the exploitation of labour for the sake of surplus value, for the sake of profiteering, and this is all made possible through the monopolisation of the means of cultural production by the capitalist class. So, as we've already addressed, it's really hard to avoid the dominance of large corporations and conglomerates when enjoying the output of cultural production, whether it's movies or music or games. And we could go further into that just by listing all the ways large corporations dominate different sectors of cultural production. And I think we all have that basic understanding at some level, right? That it's impossible to escape. They control the actual production as well as the distribution, and they also control the production of the actual tools of manufacture, right? Like movie cameras owned by large corporations, video game engines owned by large corporations, editing software owned by large corporations. I could go on. But let's dive a little deeper into how the capitalists are able to do this in the first place. We started this video talking about the capitalist class, but there's one thing I didn't really go into: the capital. What makes the capitalist class the capitalist class? It's the capital. What is capital? I'm not talking about cities here. Capital, in economic terms, is the money put forward by a capitalist in order to produce commodities to produce money. And some of that money goes to providing the immediate needs and wants of the capitalist, their mansions, their cocaine, their yachts, etc. But the larger amount of that money ultimately gets transformed back into capital. Money that produces more commodities, which produces more money, which produces more commodities, which produces more money, produces more commodities, and so on and so on. And as we've established, The aim of the capitalist is to produce surplus value, to generate more revenue than the capital they actually put into production. And again, they do this through underpaying their labourers, paying wages that reflect only a small fraction of the labour time and labour power expended by the labourer in creating the value for the capitalist. So, the capitalist ultimately ends up with more capital than they started with. Capital is everything in capitalist production, money leveraged to make more money. So you can only partake in capitalism in the first place if you have capital in the first place. Now, where does that capital come from originally? Well, it's not worth going into a long and bloody history of the exploited classes because that would take all day. The main point is that because capital is required for capitalist production, it's the people with capital and the people with a lot of capital who are able to monopolize the entire economy. Capital is the way capitalists monopolize the means of production. It's the way they buy up labor power. And the more capital you have, the more you can buy, the more you can control. And the more you have, the more risks you can take as well. And this is why cultural production is so dominated by capitalists. Cultural production of all kinds is very risky with the amount of time and effort and money it takes to make it happen. And there is always a significant chance you won't be able to make a substantial return. A large capitalist firm can afford to lose money, an independent artist less so. And even if an artist isn't looking for a hefty profit, they might still struggle to make a living. Capitalists can put multiple projects into production at once and can hedge their bets with risky and less risky ventures. But even when independent artists do make it, capitalists are the ones who also dominate distribution because of their large capital reserves. If you make a movie on your own, maybe with friends, a small independent production, a passion project maybe, you'll be lucky if you get to show it at a local film festival. But every single cinema, movie theatre in your local area, they're going to be showing the latest big Disney movie or big Warner movie. And more eyes will get on those movies than will ever get on your small, personal, independent film. And that's the thing about cultural production, and this is the bit where the production aspect meets the cultural aspect. The nature of the mode of production means that those who have substantial amounts of capital are also able to control culture. The ideas contained within this cultural output, these cultural commodities, these are the ideas that become dominant in our culture, human culture. People use this term free market a lot, this idea that the market is free and open for everyone to trade in as long as they follow basic regulations. It's one of the highest liberal ideals. It's supposedly the foundation of a free and democratic society. But the free market is a fallacy. Under capitalism, the market will never truly be free. And it's not because of regulations, but because the market is dominated by capital. And it is near impossible to break into the market, especially to break into the cultural production industry, unless you have substantial capital to risk. And so, cultural production is no true free market. It's a market controlled by capitalists. And so, in essence, culture is controlled by capitalists. And I keep using the term capitalists and capitalist class because I'm not just talking about the large corporations. Large corporations are definitely the most dominant, they have the most capital, but it's crucial that we all understand that this is also a factor with the smaller corporations, the smaller companies. Even independent firms that are for profit do seek to turn a profit year on year in the market of cultural production. These are still capitalistic in nature. Small capitalism is as much a part of this as big capitalism, as much a part of the capitalist class dominance over the economy, over cultural production, over culture itself. Culture is this amalgamation of our behaviours, our thoughts, our feelings, our ideas, our perceptions, as well as the way in which we express all that. And culture production have this sort of circular relationship. Culture informs cultural production, and the output of cultural production in turn informs culture, and so on. And when you have a class in society with dominance over cultural production, the thoughts, the feelings, the behaviours, the perceptions, etc., contained within the output of cultural production are determined by that class, in this case, the capitalist class. They get final say over what is permissible and what isn't. Stuff that isn't will be deemed non-commercial and buried. Stuff that is will be promoted. The nature of cultural production under capitalism, the reality of how commodified culture is, it means that our culture is configured to serve the interests of the capitalist class, whether that be economic interests or ideological interests. But of course, the ideological serves the economic. Capitalists can and do use their monopoly over cultural production to push agendas that serve their dominance over society, that try to get people to support capitalism, support capitalist rule, and make people complacent to capitalist exploitation. But it's very important to note that this is not always a conscious action. I am not saying that the capitalists are trying to brainwash us. That would be very reductionist and simplistic. There's no conspiracy theory here. What we're talking about here are natural economic processes that have a knock-on effect on our cultural processes. So necessarily, whether the capitalists themselves want it or not, whether they realize it or not, it is in their interest to push agendas that serve their interests through capitalist cultural production. So they will do so, whether consciously or unconsciously. Mild criticisms of capitalism might show up here and there, but for the most part, capitalist cultural production will encourage support of capitalism. It is only natural that the mode of production and the class it serves will defend themselves. It is only natural that the capitalists will promote their own class interests. And of course, it's not like we're all completely brainwashed by capitalism or anything. Sometimes they do struggle to control people in the way they want, make people think what they want. Some advertising campaigns are successful, some aren't, as an example. And of course, counterculture will also always exist, until it gets commodified by the capitalists as well. Small, independent cultural production too, as I've said throughout this video. That also obviously exists, but we'll often find a hard time getting eyeballs on it and getting that same level of cultural attention that the capitalists enjoy, especially if they try and do it without the capitalists, without their distribution. There's always going to be layers to it, little complexities here and there, little exceptions to the rule, but by and large, this is how cultural production exists under capitalism. Our culture is commodified, and that means it exists off of the back of exploited labour. Exploited labour is necessary for capitalists to produce the vast amounts of surplus value they desire, including the capital they'll use to generate more commodities and thus more surplus value. And all of this is possible through the economic dominance of the capitalist class over commodity production, just as they dominate all other areas of production. Whether we like it or not, that's how it works. And look, I'm not an economic expert. I just read a couple books on economic theory, and I wanted to express what I learned through my reading by trying to apply the theory to cultural production and see things from a different perspective. And I'm not trying to make anyone miserable or angry or paranoid or anything, nor am I trying to get people to just happily go along with it. I just want to promote a better understanding of how things work. And always with capitalism, it's important to try and find a position between apathetic acceptance and just complete immobilizing depression. If you are upset, if you are pissed off, that's fine, that's good even. But the hard thing is trying to find a good way to channel that into change. Is changing this possible? Short answer, yes. But it will be hard work. And the important thing, the most important thing, is that we recognize that all this commodified culture, is the natural development of the historical era we're living in. We are living in the capitalist era. Culture is necessarily commodified because of that. Culture is necessarily built on exploited labor because of that. Culture is necessarily monopolized by capital for the sake of profiteering because of that. And none of that will change under capitalism. The only way to end it would be by ending capitalism for good, by upending the historical era we're currently under and installing a new one. And yeah, easier said than done. Obviously, it's gonna be hard work, but it can be done. It's been done before, and we can do it again, but more successfully. Something in Marxist theory that always gives me strength is the conviction that we can treat all natural premises as the creatures of humanity, strip them of their natural character, and subjugate them to the power of individuals united. Which is to say, through unity, class unity that is. All of us that don't own capital have no monopoly ownership over the means of production. If we were to combine our strength, we could change the course of history. We could change the course of historical development, of economic development, to create a socio-economic order and a cultural order that suits all humans and not just the capitalists. So, if this video made you feel negative feelings towards capitalism at all, I suggest you go out and try to find a local group that also has negative feelings about capitalism and wants to do something about it. Finding a group like that, becoming active in it, and going out and trying to address the needs of local people in your community, that's the beginning of how you end capitalism. We start small, we start local, then we build national, and eventually we become international. It won't happen overnight, it won't happen in a year, but it will happen if we put in the work. It will happen if we try to make it happen. The way capitalism has configured cultural production upsets so many people, and for a lot of people, it's the immediate way they've come to recognize the underlying problems with capitalism. And for those people, it can perhaps be a catalyst for change. But again, it's gonna take a lot of work. In the meantime though, does this mean you can't enjoy all of this commodified culture? Well, like I said, commodified culture is the natural development of the capitalist historical era. So all cultural output will be commodified. But that doesn't mean it's automatically bad or unenjoyable. None of it is ethical. None of it is free from the taint of capitalism. But the people who actually labored to make it, the artists and others, their work should still be enjoyed. Writers can still write great stories under capitalism. Coders can still make great games under capitalism. Musicians can still compose great songs under capitalism. Yes, these are still commodities being used to enrich people other than the people who actually made them. But again, that's the nature of the historical era we're in. As long as we're conscious of that fact, that's all that matters. So enjoy it all as much as you can, but also ask yourself, can we build a better system for cultural labourers? Can we build a better system for all labourers? And if they made all this great stuff under capitalism, a system that often stifles creativity for the sake of profit, what could they make under a system where profiteering isn't a concern? Thank you for watching. This is the start of a new project where I'm hoping to expand on a lot of the stuff I touched upon in this video. I also aim to examine the content of cultural output alongside the production aspect. Please subscribe if you'd like to see future videos, and let me know in the comments below some of the stuff you'd like me to expand upon further or anything else you'd like me to cover.